Hey guys, welcome on into today's video. If you're interested in getting more political forecasting, analysis, and commentary, you can click that subscribe button. In this one, we're going to be doing a head-to-head matchup between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden on the Electoral College map. Now, the relevancy of this is the fact that both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are polling better than the rest of the field in a hypothetical Democratic primary. So we're going to put these two guys head-to-head as two candidates that we feel have the best chance of going on to win that Democratic primary. Now, Elizabeth Warren voters probably going more so to Bernie Sanders' side, and then some of the more establishment candidates like Booker, Harris, and Gillibrand, their voters probably more so going over to Joe Biden's things. Now, the information that we're going to be using to kind of make our predictions here, you see in the upper right-hand corner, this is the 2016 Democratic primary results where the green color is Bernie Sanders votes and the yellowish color is Clinton votes. We see more of a cross-section probably from Clinton voters to Joe Biden, and then Bernie retaining his voters as well. A positive that's working in Bernie Sanders' favor is he has way more name recognition across the nation this go-around than he had back in 2016. And he also has all of the support that he gained from 2016 that would come back around and support him again in 2020. And then on Biden's side of things, his positive is he's certainly a more beloved character than Hillary Clinton. And also we feel like he has a bit more reach, not just amongst the establishment Democrats, but across the spectrum in comparison to a candidate like Clinton. Now, the map below that, the one that has the orange colors on it, so the deep orange is open primaries. We see those as being advantages to Bernie Sanders. The light orange colors are mixed primaries, also an advantage to Sanders. And then the states that don't have the orange color at all, more of the gray color, those are closed primaries. And we see Joe Biden, especially in primaries where it's just registered Democrats voting, he's going to generally do better in those than the ones where independents and even Republicans are able to vote in the Democratic primary. So we're going to take that information into account as well. And then below that, we're just going to be working through the primary and caucus schedule here state by state. And caucuses, Bernie Sanders did quite well in. We see that continuing to be the case in 2020. And then the primaries, like I said, the open and mixed ones, generally Bernie did better. In the closed primaries, we see Biden doing better as well. But just in the mixed primaries and closed primaries, also Biden probably doing a little bit better than just the caucuses. Bernie Sanders voters definitely come out and support him in those caucuses. It takes a lot more time and effort to vote in a caucus, and his voters come out and support him way more so than just your average typical establishment candidate. So we're going to kind of carry that over from the results that we saw back in 2016. So now that we went through that long spiel about the kind of information that we're going to be using to make decisions on this map, we're going to get started here with the Iowa caucus. And although Hillary Clinton technically won the state, it was basically a 50-50 result. And when you consider that Bernie Sanders came into the 2016 Democratic primary as far down as 60 percentage points in an election against Clinton, it was extremely impressive that he was basically able to make it a coin flip between himself and Clinton. And the fact that it's a caucus, that plays very well for a candidate like Bernie Sanders. So we're going to go ahead and give him the state of Iowa. Moving on to New Hampshire, another area where Bernie Sanders did quite well back in 2016. This is a part of the country where Sanders is well known and quite popular. There's a lot of crossovers between a state like Vermont, where he's the senator, and New Hampshire. And we're going to go ahead and give him New Hampshire this time around again. Moving on to the Nevada caucuses, and Bernie Sanders actually did quite well here. He came up just short because this is a caucus. Even though it is a closed caucus, still nonetheless, we see this as being another very competitive matchup. Clinton was just able to get past Sanders, and that's probably going to be the case here for Joe Biden in 2020. Even though, like I said, Sanders generally does better in caucuses, but still, with it being closed, we see a lot of those establishment Democrats going for Biden like they did for Clinton. And even though it's probably really close, we're still going to give this over to Joe Biden, much like Clinton was able to claim it back in 2016. Moving on to South Carolina, And basically, every state here in the Southeast has open primaries, which generally favored Bernie Sanders, but it didn't for whatever reason back in 2016. Clinton absolutely crushed Bernie Sanders in these states. A lot of African-American voters in these Democratic primaries. Of course, the Clintons very popular amongst the African-American community, and as well as Joe Biden. He was the vice president under Obama for those 8 years and a staunch supporter of Obama. Probably a lot of crossover voters of African-American primary voters that went for Clinton would also probably go for Joe Biden as well. So we see that playing out here, and we're going to give Joe Biden the state of South Carolina. All right, so down here in the bottom right-hand corner, I'm going to try to remember to keep this scrolling down so that it's on the screen so that you can see where I'm at here. So the next result on the calendar here is going to come from the Alabama primary, and another southeastern state where Clinton destroyed Bernie Sanders. We see Biden carrying Alabama in a similar sense, maybe a bit closer in some of these southeastern races this go around, but still a lot of love for Joe Biden in this part of the country from those Democratic voters. All right, so the next state that we're going to talk about, a big one out in California, extremely close result between Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and this is a semi-open primary, so that's going to help Bernie out a little bit. And also on the left coast, very progressive voters out there. Bernie has a lot of love. If those voters come out and support him in large numbers, which you would expect them to do, we feel like Bernie's going to be able to outperform what he did out in California here in 2020 compared to 2016, especially with the overwhelming amount of name recognition he has this time around in comparison to the last go around. So it's probably very close, but at the end of the day, we're going to give one of the most progressive states in the United States over to Bernie Sanders. All right, so now moving on to Colorado, the caucus there. Bernie Sanders did very well back in 2016. The fact that it's a caucus, we see it going over to him again in 2020. The Georgia primary, a southeastern state. Bernie Sanders did not do well there. Like I've been saying, we see that going over to Joe Biden as a result, with those Clinton voters crossing over and going to his side of things. Moving up to the Massachusetts primary. Now, Bernie Sanders actually did pretty well up in Massachusetts. It was basically a 50-50 between him and Clinton. He has even more name recognition this time around, and it's in the Northeast, which is kind of Bernie Sanders territory. It's probably pretty close, but at the end of the day, we're still going to give this state over to Bernie Sanders. If I can click on it. There we go. And then Minnesota, it's a caucus. Bernie Sanders did tremendously well in the Minnesota caucuses back in 2016, and we see that being the case again here, so we're going to give him Minnesota. Moving on to Oklahoma, and kind of throughout the Great Plains areas, there's a lot of caucuses. Bernie Sanders did very well in this area back in 2016. He was able to take down Clinton. We see a lot of that carrying over again here, so we're going to be giving him the state of Oklahoma. Moving on down to Tennessee, it's a primary there. It's an open primary, but still one of those southeastern states that Clinton did very well in comparison to Sanders. Sanders did a bit better here in terms of the even further southeastern states, but still we see a lot of that Clinton vote going over to Biden, so we're going to be giving him Tennessee. Moving on to Texas, kind of a similar result to what we saw over in Tennessee if you just look at the percentage of votes that both Clinton and Sanders got back in 2016. Probably a little bit closer now that Sanders has more name recognition this time around, but still, at the end of the day, probably Joe Biden just eking out this state and what's probably going to be a very close result there. Moving on to the Virginia primary, we look at the map and kind of a similar result over to what we saw in Tennessee and Texas as well. Clinton did pretty well here. A lot of establishment Democrat voters in the state of Virginia, especially in kind of the northeast portion of the state. Probably a pretty competitive result, but at the end of the day, Biden probably hanging on to this state like Clinton was able to do. Moving on to the Vermont primary, no contest here. Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly going to win his home state where he's a senator from. Moving on to the Kansas results here. And if we look back in 2016, Bernie Sanders doing tremendously well in the state of Kansas. We see that carrying over again here. So we're going to be giving him the state of Kansas. Scrolling down a little bit more, The Louisiana primary, it's a closed primary. Bernie Sanders got absolutely demolished down here again in the Southeast. We see Biden probably carrying through on that again in 2020. Now we have the Nebraska Caucus, another state where Bernie Sanders did well in back in 2016, and it's a caucus, so we're going to go ahead and give that to him. And now we're moving into the meat of really what was kind of a surprise result, certainly back in 2016, the Michigan primary. It's open. That really played into Bernie Sanders' favor back in 2016. All of the polling, for whatever reason, in the state of Michigan had Clinton winning by 15 to 20 percentage points a lot of the time. But on the day where people were allowed to vote in this open primary, Bernie Sanders got a ton of crossover votes. He went on to upset Clinton in what's one of the biggest surprises I've ever seen, especially in contrast to what the polls were saying. But we see just a lot of those blue-collar voters who really love and support Bernie Sanders' message as voting for him, and we see it as likely as that he would win the state of Michigan again, just like he was able to do against Clinton back in 2016. All right, now Missouri, they have an open primary, so that helps Bernie Sanders. It was extremely close between Sanders and Clinton back in 2016. With his increased name recognition this time around, the fact that it's an open primary, we feel like Sanders would be able to win the state of Missouri, but probably still a pretty close result there with Biden. The Mississippi primary, going back to the Southeast, which has not been favorable all that often to Bernie Sanders, we see Joe Biden probably being able to pick up that one as well, just like Clinton was able to absolutely dominate Bernie Sanders. There's no other way about it. If you look at Mississippi, it was one of the best performing states that Clinton performed in. We see Biden doing quite well in that state, certainly. All right, guys, moving on to the Ohio primary. Back in 2016, we had Hillary Clinton beating out Bernie Sanders. It was actually kind of a surprise when you think about it, especially with Michigan going to Bernie Sanders. Usually there's a lot of similar kind of crossover votes between Michigan and Ohio. Ohio maybe a little bit more of a conservative state than the state of Michigan, but Clinton's somewhat surprisingly able to win that primary in Ohio. It is a mixed primary, so that helps Sanders a little bit. Probably a pretty competitive result, but since Clinton was able to win Ohio, we're going to give it over to Joe Biden. Scrolling on down here, let's see, Florida primary. That is a state where we have closed primaries, so that is definitely going to help the establishment candidate in Joe Biden, where Bernie Sanders is not going to be able to get that independent vote to help him out. And we look back in 2016, Bernie Sanders was somewhat respectable, especially in comparison to some of these other southeastern states, but still got beat pretty handily by Clinton. So we see Joe Biden being able to carry the state of Florida in this go-round. Moving on to the state of Illinois, where we have a semi-open primary, so that helps Bernie Sanders out a little bit. We look back at the 2016 map, basically a 50-50 between Sanders and Clinton in terms of the number of votes they got, and more name recognition, certainly this time around in Illinois, but it'll just be very interesting. This is one of the more interesting states because Barack Obama, the senator prior in the state of Illinois, grew up through there and working his way through Chicago, of course, and he'll definitely be endorsing Joe Biden, his vice president. So that probably plays pretty well in a state like Illinois. If he didn't have that Obama factor, I'd probably give this state to Bernie Sanders, but with Obama's support in a state like Illinois, that means a heck of a lot. So we're going to go ahead and give this to Joe Biden. Probably pretty close, but still, I feel like that Obama factor for Biden definitely helps him out in a state like Illinois. Okay, moving on to Arizona, where Hillary Clinton did quite well, and part of this is because it was a closed primary, getting over 50% of the vote there against Bernie Sanders, but maybe a little bit closer than you might expect in a closed primary. We see that Joe Biden probably doing a similar kind of result here. Maybe Bernie does a little bit better, makes it a little bit closer, but at the end of the day, we're going to give that over to Joe Biden. And then the Idaho caucuses. Now, this is a caucus, and Bernie Sanders absolutely demolished Hillary Clinton there. She barely got any of that caucus result. We're going to go ahead and give him this state just because he did so tremendous there back in 2016, and it's a caucus, so that helps him out quite a bit. Then we have the Utah Caucus, another state where Bernie Sanders did tremendously well. So we're going to give him that state here this go round. Scrolling on down a little bit here, we have the Washington Caucus, another state where Bernie Sanders did tremendously well. So we're going to give him that result. The 2016 result against Clinton, he just completely blew her out of the water. We see that carrying over into 2020. And moving on to the Alaska Caucus, another caucus, and Bernie Sanders just completely dominating Hillary Clinton up in Alaska. We see him being able to carry that state again. And then the Hawaii Caucus, another area where Bernie Sanders did tremendously well, a very progressive state. We see him being able to carry the state of Hawaii. We already touched on Colorado, so moving on here to the Wisconsin primary. Bernie Sanders able to win this primary. It's an open primary. That definitely helps him out. Kind of a similar result over to what we saw in Michigan, except even more so going for Bernie Sanders. We see that being the case here again in 2020, so we're going to be giving him the state of Wisconsin. Then we have the Wyoming Caucus, another caucus where Bernie Sanders did great in back in 2016, so we're going to give him Wyoming. All right, now moving on to the New York primary, if we can get that in the shot here. So the New York primary, Bernie Sanders growing up in Brooklyn definitely helps him out. Clinton being the senator from the state of New York helped her out in that primary. We see maybe a result where Bernie Sanders probably does a bit better this time around, more name recognition, and not having to go against someone who was a senator from the state of New York is going to help him out. So we actually see Bernie Sanders up here in the Northeast being able to get New York this time around, even though he wasn't able to get it back in 2016. His Brooklyn ties help him out, and he's just very popular up here in the northeastern part of the United States. Probably a very close result. Of course, Joe Biden kind of has his ties in this particular part of the country as well, but with Bernie getting that vote, even with New York being a close primary, I know I said close primaries kind of work against him a bit. Probably an extremely close result. Wouldn't be surprised to see it go either way, but with his Brooklyn ties, we're going to be giving him the state of New York. Moving on here to the Connecticut primaries, we look back here at 2016, and Connecticut was actually pretty close of a result, just going for Hillary Clinton. And there's kind of that crossover between the Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and those Connecticut voters, somewhat similar in certain ways. We see this as being a part of the country where Bernie Sanders can get a lot of support from, so we're going to give him the state of Connecticut. Delaware, for whatever reason, that crossover that you'd see over in the Northeast where Bernie Sanders did pretty well against Clinton, it didn't necessarily carry over as we moved south more into the New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland section of the map. So that Delaware primary probably certainly going over to Joe Biden, especially when we look at the results where Clinton did pretty well in the state of Delaware back in 2016. And then, like I said, that Maryland result, Clinton did quite well in the state of Maryland, and we see Joe Biden getting Maryland there as well, getting those Clinton voters. And then the Pennsylvania primary, it's a closed primary, unfortunately, for Bernie Sanders. And even though it was a closed primary, he still actually did quite well for himself in 2016, almost getting upwards of about 45% or so of the vote. But Joe Biden really cutting his teeth, of course, in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Has got a lot of love there in the state. So we're going to go ahead and give Biden that state of Pennsylvania, especially since it is a closed primary. And then Rhode Island, if we look back at 2016, Bernie Sanders did quite well, actually, in Rhode Island, and there's just a lot of love for him up there in the Northeast, so we're going to go ahead and give him Rhode Island again in this go-round. And then the main results, if we look back at 2016, Bernie Sanders absolutely dominated Clinton, and maybe he doesn't dominate Joe Biden in the same kind of way, but still up here in the Northeast, we'd be surprised if this state didn't go Bernie Sanders' direction. Now moving on to Indiana, the primary there. It's an open primary, so that's going to help Bernie Sanders out. We look back at 2016. Bernie Sanders able to win this, and I attribute a lot of that to it being an open primary. A lot of those independent voters coming out in supporting him. If he was able to win it in 2016, we feel like he'd probably be able to win it here in 2020, even against probably a little bit tougher of a competition in a state like Indiana going against Joe Biden. And then the North Carolina primary, pretty close result there between Sanders and Clinton. If we look here, South Carolina overwhelmingly going for Clinton, and even Virginia in comparison to North Carolina, kind of sandwiching between those two areas, but Clinton able to get Virginia. It was a bit closer in North Carolina, but still Clinton was able to pick it up, so we're going to give that over to Joe Biden. And then the West Virginia primary, a state where Bernie Sanders did very well against Clinton, and those progressive policies very popular in a state like West Virginia, so we're going to give that over to Bernie Sanders. And we're getting kind of down the wire here. Arkansas, a state where Bernie Sanders didn't do so well, down in the southeastern portion of the country, so we're going to give that over to Joe Biden. Not a whole lot of states left here, and we have an extremely close result between Bernie and Biden. I didn't fill out this map beforehand. I'm actually kind of shocked at how close it's been as we work our way through this. So going on to the Kentucky primary, it's a closed primary, and even though it was a closed primary, Bernie Sanders did tremendously well. It was basically a 50-50 result between him and Clinton, but the fact that it is a closed primary does work against Bernie Sanders, so we are going to give this over to Joe Biden, as those registered Democrats a little bit probably more likely to vote for him, even though it's probably going to be pretty close there. If Kentucky had a more open primary, it definitely would give it over to Sanders, but the fact that it's closed, we're going to be giving it here to Biden. Now moving out to Oregon, a state where Bernie Sanders was able to win. It is a closed primary, but progressive politics works very well out here on the West Coast, so we're going to be giving him the state of Oregon. Moving on to Montana, where Bernie Sanders was able to win Montana. It is an open primary, so that helps him out. It's not a caucus like some of these other states out in this portion of the country, but still the fact that it is an open primary, we feel like he would be able to take the state of Montana again in 2020. And then the North Dakota caucuses, Sanders did tremendously well back in 2016. It's another caucus, so we're going to be giving him North Dakota. And look at that, 257 to 256, really crazy results here. Moving on to South Dakota, there is a primary there. It is a semi-open primary. If we look at the results in 2016, basically a 50-50 result between Clinton and Sanders. And we see a very close result here, but the fact that Clinton was just able to pick it up in 2016, we're going to give South Dakota over to Joe Biden. All right, now moving on to New Jersey, a state where Clinton did tremendously well, and we probably see a lot of crossover, especially in this particular part of the country. For whatever reason, Clinton did quite well in comparison to Bernie Sanders, especially when you contrasted over to the Northeast. Oops, I touched Delaware there, but we're going to give New Jersey over to Biden, and that officially puts him over the top, getting 273, but we're going to finish off this map here, moving on to New Mexico. Now, New Mexico is a state where Clinton was able to win. It is a closed primary, so that works in Biden's favor. It was basically a 50-50 between Bernie and Clinton, but if this was a semi-open primary or an open primary, we'd give it to Bernie, but the fact that it is a closed primary, we're going to give that to Biden as well. And then I believe the District of Columbia is the last thing on the list here, so if we look back, Bernie Sanders, I believe he did quite well. It's kind of hard to see on this map with the District of Columbia, but of course, a ton of African-American vote there, so that would more so go over to Clinton's side of things, but also very progressive voters in the District of Columbia. At this point, it's kind of trivial where we put this particular result. We're going to go ahead and give it to Joe Biden, especially there is a lot of African-American vote there, so that probably helps out his cause. And just the surrounding states we have given to him as well, so that probably carries over into the District of Columbia as well. So a very close result here between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Of course, we had a very close result between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders back in 2016. That was back before Bernie Sanders had the name recognition that he has this go-around, but we also feel like Biden would be able to perform better than Hillary Clinton because he's a more popular figure, not just amongst establishment Democrats, but he has a bit more wide of a reach than Clinton might have with, for instance, independent voters. and just more progressive voters that might be in as registered Democrats. So we see this as being very close. Wouldn't be surprised to see it go either way, to tell you the truth. Some of these states that we gave Joe Biden, we very well could just have easily probably given over to Sanders, like Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, in particular, maybe even Nevada. So for those states, let's just say they would go over to Bernie's side. So that already puts them over the top here with just flipping a state like Illinois. If you got Ohio, Pennsylvania, Nevada, then all of a sudden we have a blowout situation. Those are probably some of the more competitive states that would really decide this particular election. But then, of course, you could also say that on the other side, maybe Biden picks up a state like Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Missouri, California. Those maybe could go his way as well. But this is just the first map that I've done between Bernie and Biden. I'll probably make more as we get closer to the Democratic primary and when we finally kind of get more information on who's going to be running and going against each other and get a bit more polling out there to kind of help us out a bit and making another map in the future. So thanks guys for stopping on in. Kind of a long video here. We were a little bit meticulous in going through state by state, looking at the 2016 results and then looking at whether they had a caucus, a primary, and whether that primary was closed or open, which definitely is going to have an effect based on the candidates that are in this head-to-head matchup. So thanks for stopping on in, guys. Subscribe for more, and we hope to see you in future videos. Bye.